welcome to Round the Table with the Hero Round Table. You're in Bonnie, Scotland at the moment. Whereabouts in Scotland?
I live just south of the capital city, Edinburgh, in a lovely wee village called West Linton. So it's an old farming village. Really, it's only about 20 minutes from the city centre, so it's nice. It's got the best of both worlds into the city, but living in the country is just lovely. So we're very cold this morning. We're in winter.
Yeah, I'm sweating here. Still, even at 7 o'clock at night. So we're going to have to get some subtitles for some of our American viewers, I'm sure, as we go through.
Don't think so.
So in Scotland, what's your career been, and how's it got to where you are now, and what are you doing now?
Yeah, well, I left school 17, 18 years old and joined the police service. So 1987, as a young 19-year-old boy, I joined Lothian and Borders Police and spent the last 30 years of my career, also the last 30 years of my life, working in the police service. You know, how I often say to people, I spent the first 20 years of my police service filling prisons up, but the last 10 years trying to empty prisons. So prevention of especially violence has been a big passion of mine in the last 10 years. How can we start to, prevent things for the long term rather than just the short term? Because I think in the past, politicians, police service have been fixed on just, satisfying that desire from society to make things look better. And I think in doing so, we tend to focus on short-term gains rather than the long-term game, which is to surely make things better. And, I firmly believe that, violence is preventable. It's not inevitable. So a big part of my career is looking at violence prevention. As I say, I spent my early years in the police service working in a place in Edinburgh which was renowned. I don't know if anybody of your viewers have seen the film Trainspotting, which looks at the stereotype of the drug addict. My early career was in the Trainspotting days, and it was horrible. It was violent. It was dirty. Friends turned on friends. Friends watched friends being killed, being assaulted, being stabbed. It was a time when there's things I know now that I didn't know back then. But one thing that really I remember being really frustrated with was why didn't people act? Why didn't people, your friends about to be killed, your friends about to be hurt? Why are you not doing anything? And I think that planted a seed way back then. For me, when I retired from the police service, to look at how can I use the skills that I've developed over the last 30 years, but primarily in the last 10 years, looking at prevention, to try and help society move from the passive to the active. And in my last 10 years of my police service, I started working with the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. And what this organisation did was they applied a public health lens to prevention, which looked at who's done the crime, but why is it happening? What is contributing towards it? And a big part of my career then was implementing bystander programs into high schools. How do we get young people to step up but do it safely? How do we create a conversation around violence and around bullying, domestic violence, sexual violence that doesn't alienate certain parts of society, doesn't tell boys and men you should be doing this, or doesn't tell girls and women that they need to behave properly or dress correctly or not drink as much alcohol. I think the bystander approach that we've adopted in Scotland is very much one that, we give tools, but we want to talk about the issue. How do we talk about the issue? How do we bring healthy norms to the surface? So that's been a big part of my last few years in the police service. And I suppose I retired, far too young to retire from policing. I retired at the age of 49. But I think in the last 4 or 5 years, started to see there was potential for me to take this work into various settings. So since retiring, I've set up my own sort of company, Cultivating Minds UK, which is just to create discussions, to create conversations. And I work in schools, universities, with sports teams, working in corporates, around bullying, sexual violence, sexual harassment, which is a big conversation just now. How do we help sports teams, schools, universities, and corporates sort of really get on the front foot with these issues, and rather wait for them to happen and bring the policy off the shelf? How do we equip employees and students with tools to spot it,
right,
and deal with it before it becomes an issue? And I think that's a quick summary of what I'm doing just now.
Yeah, so before we get into the bystander part, because that's definitely a big piece of the hero conversation, was there something that prompted you to have that change in approach 10 years ago? You said the first 20 were putting people into jail, and then the last 10 keeping them out. Was there a moment that changed that?
I think it was, in the last couple of years, I've met the likes of yourself and spoken to Dr. Phil and around all the issues around heroism. And I suppose for me, it was an opportunity. I went from working in a large police force in Scotland, and I got an opportunity to be seconded to work with the Violence Reduction Unit. And in the first few months of that, transition into that role, I was forced to take my old police hat off and put a new one on, which forced me to look beyond the physical act of violence. So look at the story behind the offender, the story behind the victim. And there was people there, in your world of heroism, you talk about heroes and villains. And for me, I met a number of people who gave me the space to transform, to learn new things. I credit a lady like Suzanne Zierich, who specialises in trauma, early years trauma, and she just allowed me to talk and to make say the wrong thing, say the right thing. But listening to her, my boss at the time, really was an old police officer done 30 years in the police service. So he'd transitioned years ago into the world, and really looking. And when you started to look beyond the physical act of violence, and you started to look at the backstory of the perpetrator or the victim, things like domestic violence were a big part of their early years. Child sexual abuse, a big part of their early years. Living in poverty, big part of their early years. And whilst alone these things are not, don't mean that a person will go on to be a victim or a perpetrator of violence, we can't ignore these adverse childhood experiences. And the study that was done in America many years ago, which looked at the impact of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, if you start to add all these experiences together, you can start to potentially have negative outcomes in the future. I think that's saying the mind might forget, but the body won't forget. And what we started to look at Scotland was, how do we overcome the early years trauma, and the word's resilience. So how can we start to provide, if we can retrofit kids, young adults with resilience, then we can hopefully overcome these issues. So I met many people that gave me the space, gave me the knowledge. I suppose I took some responsibility and started to learn more, read about the subject matter, talk about it. I had my old colleagues, who I would call the villains in many respects, who were trying to say, that's nonsense, Graham. It's that you're going soft. Come back to this side, Yeah. But I think I started to see things that I can't unsee about the world. Don't ever think that I'm excusing a person's behaviour. I'm not excusing, but I'm really interested in the culture, the climate, the air that people are breathing, which could potentially, make them conform to certain types of behaviour. So I suppose once you started to see these types of research, this new knowledge, I started to think differently on the subject. And when you look at men, especially young men in prisons, women are in prison, but predominantly it's young men that are in prison, men that are in prison. If you look behind these young men and the stories, it's trauma, it's abuse, it's seeing their mothers, their daughters being victims of domestic violence, sexual violence. It's living in a community where violence is the tool, the everyday tool. So is it any wonder, if you keep consuming this air, is it any wonder you potentially go on to commit offences or become addicted to alcohol, substance, because you're just numbing the pain. And the saying hurt people is a big thing that we say in Scotland. And it doesn't excuse behaviour. It allows us to understand. So I went from a police officer who simply looked at who had done it, who had committed the offence, to, yeah, let's deal with that, but let's start to ask the question why and what. And I think that's been the big transition in Scotland, where we've had some big successes in preventing violence. We're looked at around the world. We've gone from, Europe's most violent neighbour to, one of the safest places to be. Our statistics in violence are coming down drastically, but we'll never say we've solved the problem, because we're still people lose their lives. So, but we are doing things better. I think the narrative is consistent as well. So I think my journey was just knowledge, but people, and giving the space to talk and learn.
Yeah. And so I see that a lot of the people that we know in the Hero Round Table world talk about the hero's journey, and it seems that was a big journey for you, was leaving that the old world of the enforcement. What would you like? Obviously, it's a systemic problem: poverty, violence. How were you in that department attacking that? What were the main ways that you were dealing with that? Because you can't solve poverty, obviously, but how were you, after looking to see what the commonalities were and what those indicators were, what were you doing to reduce the actual crime?
I think for me, you're right. These are systemic problems that require many solutions and from many different fronts. And for me, looking in my small world of violence prevention, it was about realising that, for example, we did big bit of work around gangs in Glasgow. Whilst gangs in some parts of the world is about drugs, it's about money, gangs in Glasgow is about territory. It was these gangs had been there for decades. But there was sons of sons of sons. It was just expected. And a lot, when you looked at the backstory of the people in these gangs, a lot of them were leading really hopeless lives, where they had no employment opportunities. Nothing was good in their world. They were living in violent families, and the gang was the family. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need love, support. That's the basis of our existence. So what we tried to look at in Glasgow was, we need government to look at the social policies around, to people on living wage, etc. But how do we get people away from the gangs? Being in a gang's okay. I was in a gang when I was a kid, but I was climbing trees and cleaning neighbours' driveways for a 10 pence piece. But the violence has to stop. That was the big message in Glasgow. But here's the way out of that. Here's some organisations that can give you support, training, and now we're looking at how do we give people employment? How do we get people away from these issues through paid employment? The best way to, imagine if you wake up every morning and you're thinking to yourself, what's the point? What's the point in getting up? We need to give people a sense of purpose. And that's one thing we try to do in Glasgow, where we try to give people, and across Scotland, give people that sense of worth, that sense that we do care about you, we do understand the issues that are behind you, and we want to help it. So in Scotland, it's been a slow drip, Matt. It's not been something we've done overnight. It's been trying to change that steadying the ship, that big oil tanker, trying to turn it. And it's for me, it's just been the narrative. It's been dripping in words like adverse childhood experience, dripping in resilience, dripping in, domestic, talking about domestic violence. There'll never be peace in the streets in our world, but peace in the home. So it's just getting society, who are often quick to judge people. Philip Zimbardo talks about homeless people. We should be using the phrase "people without homes." It's the little things that will change that ship direction, and that I think has been happening in Scotland. So I think it's been trying to build compassion from society. It's been a big thing for us. But how do we give hope to the hopeless? And a lot of that is through just being there, understanding. But things like, we're on employability programs now in Scotland based on some of the stuff in America, the LA, the Homeboy project. We've looked at programs around the world and how can we put a kilt on these programs and bring them to Scotland? How can we Scotify them? How can we, acknowledge where they've come from, but make them fit? Rather than come up with brand new ideas,
right?
Well, let's look at the evidence. So it's been a drip, of different programs. But for me, I said a few weeks ago, it's the narrative. What's changed in Scotland? It's the courage to have a narrative that we know is making things better and stick to that narrative.
Yeah.
So it's a drip. For me.
So is there now or a noticeable change in the attitudes of the police? You said initially they were saying you'd gone soft. So is it a pretty well accepted approach now, or is that still an ongoing piece?
No, I think it's like any hero's journey. There's always, my job now in this, if you apply the analogy of the hero's journey, it's, I'm back in the world now, and I'm just trying to, I want to be the hero to somebody else, to give them the knowledge, to allow them to see things that I can see. Right. But there's still a pressure from society for the police to do the police thing, and the police thing is to go out and arrest people and fill the prisons up. So I think in Scotland, policing is now starting to see the impact of gender. Violence in the world is mostly committed by men, against young boys. Women are victims of men's violence. Men are victims. Young boys are victims of some men's violence. So I think we're starting to talk about that. A lot of policing colleagues now are talking about adversity. How does a police officer respond to a young person who will have been a victim of sexual abuse, will have experienced domestic violence? And so I think we're giving police officers a narrative that they can use at 3:00 in the morning when this person's is kicking off in a pub or a house or a street. Don't go in there with your two left feet, because your behaviour will have a consequence. Right. And the science says that if people suffering from trauma, if I react in a very negative way, they'll respond in a defensive way, and that could end up in a police officer being punched in the face. Could end up in a police officer being taken off the street for 3 hours to write a report. So it's about how do we get cops to respond a lot differently. I think as well, one thing we're seeing now is policing listening to our advice around violence prevention is not showing so many negative things about knife carrying, for example. We don't show big knives on our websites and our videos anymore, because we know that actually can make things worse. If you look at London, right, classic example, London just now is they're really struggling. They're trying to look at the Scottish model, but they've got people pulling them in different directions. And it's, for me, there's lots of egos coming up in London. Whereas we need to, if there's egos at play, we will not solve the issue. We need to come together. What's our common purpose? Yeah. Solve violence, right? Let's do it. So I think policing hasn't got it sorted, but it's definitely getting better. I think we're starting things we know now that we didn't know all those years ago.
Yeah, so the ego question is an interesting one for me. So as this change started to happen in Scotland, and you were part of that, was there one clear voice that was pushing in that direction, or was it a number of people that just decided enough was enough, or how did that happen? Because that's absolutely the problem, is how do you have a good idea and then get it accepted, get it spread without it becoming a gang itself, or it's that group think, and this is our idea. And
I think for me, that there hasn't been. There's been leaders. My old boss John Carnahan is credited with setting up the violence reduction unit, but I think John and his counterpart Karen McCluskey, who are two leading lights in the violence prevention world, they allowed other voices to come up, including my voice, including the voice of doctors and medics, to talk about their frustrations and continually having to stitch people's faces up when they could be doing other things with their time. We made, lots of parents of knife crime victims had a voice, were given a space to talk about. Parents of domestic violence victims were given a voice. So I think what's coming to it's like attacking this on so many different fronts. and using platforms like social media to drip the narrative.
Yeah.
And I talk about prevention as being like a dripping tap. If you drip the glass and the tap drips into the glass, it's going to fill up, and then eventually it's going to overflow. And the overflow is in the communities and the schools, the universities, and I think we're dripping this narrative into all these different settings. So it hasn't been, and also government in Scotland is very forward thinking. We're lucky in Scotland that we have a small country, 5 million people. We're still part of the UK for the time being. Who knows where that's going to go in the future? But we have a Scottish government who. When my organisation started, the violence reduction, it was very much a Labour-controlled government who gave us the support. But in the years that followed, the Scottish Nationalist Party, SNP, they continued that funding for the violence reduction unit. So we're lucky that we've got lots of different parties coming together to acknowledge we need to do this, and we are riding high on the violence prevention field. We're being looked at around the world as a leading light in how we tackle these issues. So consistent narrative, lots of people coming together and being given the space.
Yeah. So one of the approaches of the many approaches was the bystander intervention training and awareness. So where did that come from? What's the implementation? Who's leading that internationally? What are you using to do that?
I think what happened with that, back in 2010, I was introduced to a now friend and colleague, Jackson Katz from the United States, and Jackson was across in Scotland speaking at some conferences, and my boss says, my manager at the time, my boss said at the time, we're giving some funding to this, and he's going to speak at one of our events. And a key part of our violence reduction strategy, the first part is about contain and manage. How do we deal with the issues that we're seeing? That's policing. But at the same time, how do we build partnerships where we start to change the norms, shift the attitudes that contribute to levels of violence? So when we heard Jackson speak, I just remember that the day, like it was yesterday, sitting in this conference hall, Jackson speaking about his work, the bystander approach, the role of men in preventing violence. And my boss said to me, Graham, that's your job. We want this in Scotland. So I spent the next year just finding more about the approach, and looked at models in the US, looked at Jackson's Mentors and Violence Prevention model, saw it working, saw the evidence in the parts of Iowa where I go there quite frequently. And we like the evidence, like what we see, like what we saw in the program. And we just, as I said before, we just put a kilt on it and brought it from Iowa, from America, and started working initially in the high schools. So we wanted to, how do we help our young people develop skills and strategies to help each other out? But very quickly, I saw this as more than just a violence prevention tool. Schools are places of learning. They're places of young people being successful, contributing to the success of Australia, Scotland, the United States. If you don't feel safe in your school, you won't learn.
Right.
So very quickly, I started to. We often talk about the shared agenda in Scotland, and the shared agenda is when you look at one organisation and another organisation, and you think, where do you share? What's your common purpose? In schools and policing, the common purpose is relationships. If you build relationships in a school, you will have young people feeling safe, supported, and they will learn. If you have good relationships in the society, people get on with each other. They don't fall out with each other. So there's less violence. So the big push in schools was, how do we help you build relationships? And we started to build a model from 3 schools to 9 schools to 21 schools, and I believe now, I passed over the bystander work when I retired in the state system, and I believe we're in about 120, 130 schools across Scotland. We developed a real sustainable model for schools to be self-sustaining with their own trainers, their own abilities to keep building the model. And we started in 2010, it's 2018, and we've got the school that started the program still doing it. So,
Fantastic.
And this isn't delivered by teachers or police or whoever, it's delivered by young people. So we train young people to be the mentors. These young men, these young women who are at the coalface, they've got the experience, the lived experience. How can we help them be the heroes in the lives of younger people at the school? Talking about bullying, domestic violence, sexual harassment, hate crime, a whole range of different subjects. So, and that model has allowed us a tool to talk about violence and abuse within a school setting, so that young people start to learn about the subject, become more aware of the issue, be challenged on their thinking, but given tools and strategies to act, to help their friends. And that can only be good for society when they leave school, into university, in the workplace, in the community. So it's about how do we use the bystander approach to fit into a violence prevention strategy. And for me, I've taken that analogy of relationships into the workplace. If you're in a workplace where you don't feel safe, you won't perform. If you're in a sports team where you feel there's initiations, hazings, things going on, you won't perform. Any distraction off the field will become a distraction on the field. So how do we help create safe spaces? And I find the bystander approach a really good way of creating that safe space.
And so when you're bringing in young people to be the trainers and mentors, when you say young, what young, how young?
Yeah, our mentors are usually about 16, 17.
Okay.
So they're in the last couple of years of school, of high school. In Scotland we have primary 1 to 7, so that's from 5 to about 11, and then they transition to the high school from 11 till about 17. We have 6 years, so first year, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth year at school. So the fifth and sixth year, that's our core mentor target group. So they are trained to deliver the program to the first years, the second years. But what we find, the evidence we're getting, is that not only does the program really help the school overall, but the young people who deliver it, the fifth and sixth years, they get so much from the program, and that'll help them when they're applying for forms, the skills for life. Imagine, going back to when you were 16, think of the skills you could get if you were standing delivering training sessions.
Yeah.
The confidence you would get. But also the knowledge you're getting on the subjects is giving you a good grounding for when you hit university, for you to hit the workplace. And the issues we're seeing in society just now around sexual harassment, sexual violence, domestic violence, bullying in the adult world, if we can start to seed the world with everyday heroes that are more aware of these issues, then that hopefully will have a knock-on effect in the future.
Right. And so is the school generally hiring you to come in to train those mentors and then they just deliver the programming? That's the general relationship?
Yeah, I suppose what the way it works in Scotland is that the program in the state system that I've passed this on to Education Scotland, to our main governing body for schools and whatnot in Scotland. But Scottish Government fund a team within Education Scotland, and they go out and they just build relationships with local authority areas, with schools, and they go in and train teachers and partners. Yeah. So there could be a team of teachers, police officers, youth workers, women's aid advocates, whoever, and their job is then to go back to the schools and train the young people.
Yeah.
And then the young people then, with support in the year, deliver a few sessions in the year as part of our health and wellbeing curriculum or whatever. So that's the model.
Yeah. So it's reaching each year 1 or year 2 in the school once or twice a year, or is it an ongoing?
It's an ongoing process. The schools that are really pushing the program are dripping this model into the first and second years, but they're also dripping it into the English curriculum. If you're talking about, for example, Romeo and Juliet in English, there's so much links to bystanders and all these different stories that you can bring in and have that conversation.
Yeah.
Looking at modern studies in politics, social politics, looking at crime in society. You can drip it into the good school. The ones that really have embraced this, that are more advanced, they've been doing it and they've been slowly dripping it across the schools, are now looking a lot wider. So young people are getting the messages everywhere, and posters in the school, at assemblies, and the big assemblies, looking at the bystander approach. On Holocaust Memorial Day, looking at the role of bystanders there. So it's just dripping this stuff in, throughout the school year. So, but MVP isn't the only program that tackles these issues. There's lots of other programs that schools will bring in, other organisations, to focus on certain aspects of the curriculum, but they all complement each other. MVP isn't. I never wanted MVP to be to push people away.
Right.
Where you need to be in this. It's all the different fronts coming together. So MVP is part of a suite of options for school to pick and choose. But I suppose the benefit of MVP is it's sustainable. It's not relying on another organisation coming in.
Yeah,
They can do it themselves.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that it's given me an opportunity to pivot to another topic. But that willingness to work with others and that enthusiasm to work with others is, I think, so important for any idea to spread, and generally for our world to flourish. But it's increasingly in the UK and in the US, in Australia, and I'm sure, well, I know lots of other places as well, there's this binary division that's happening over and over, right? And so a couple of things. Is that something that you're starting to address in the trainings in regards to sort of the Brexit voting and attitude and mindset of how do we get along? And I say this on the day that the second day of the Catholic high school boys and the Native American guy and the African American Islam group in DC has began as a very polarizing us against them and look how bad they are, to being flipped the next day to saying, well, hang on, that wasn't us and you're always attacking us, and it's just, it seems every day of the week one of these polarizing issues comes up, and there's very little willingness to identify that anyone with an opposing view would have any similar views to you. So is that something that you're addressing in the UK and in Scotland particularly?
I think when it comes to partnerships, let's take it back to the bystander work in the schools. Again, I talked about the shared agenda. All these organisations that we bring together in the school, the police, the teachers, the women's aid workers, the youth workers, they all share this agenda of healthy relationships. And I think if you extend that out with the school, we all thrive from healthy relationships. So that's the school setting. So that's the message to bring people together. If we can get this right, then we're all going to benefit. Police officers are going to spend less time dealing with issues in the streets. Victims organisations are going to spend less time having to work with victims because there'll be less victims, hopefully. Teachers will see their academic attainment going up. All good. So that's the school setting. But yeah, we live in a polarised world. Yeah, Brexit is the big thing where, today in the UK, our Prime Minister is supposed to be talking about Plan B, which is apparently going to bring us together.
Yeah.
When you have a referendum that is 52-48 or whatever it is, that's the issue. The issue we've got just now. And I don't want to get into politics of that, but there needs to be a middle ground. How do we? And the middle ground for me is the conversation. Unless we're able to create a conversation about what happened in the United States with the Native American and the Catholic school pupil, unless we can try and find a middle ground. And for me, the middle ground in that conversation is, we can focus on the boy. We can focus on the boy, and we can focus on his behaviour. And if you look behind him and his friends, white male friends with their phones out, egging him on, keep going. we need to focus wider than that. Why are these boys behaving like that? We're in America just now, the air is toxic. It's fear. And whilst these young boys are behaving in a way that I think is completely abhorrent and wrong, why are they behaving like that? Where's that coming from?
Well, I think that's what happened on day 2, and I've just realised that you've been asleep while all this came out, probably. But there's been a 2-hour video of the whole sort of event, and the boys are not as the blame's certainly not on all their side. So they were getting antagonised earlier by a different group, being called names and being told to get out of there, and then there was a coming together of sort of 3 disparate groups, and that they were certainly not the aggressors. And I think that's part of that problem, is everyone jumped straight onto that, as you say, they didn't see the context. They didn't look back and say, well, what could have caused this? So and that's what we're doing. We're quick to get that gotcha, like we won this one.
I also think as well that what that young boy was doing, there's no excuse for that. That young boy should have been able to deal with the backlash against him and think, you know what, I'm not going to take my frustrations out on this guy and just antagonize him. But we saw that a similar polarized debate. You mentioned the Gillette advert last week. We've got an advert which I love diversity in advertising, and it's nice to see a global company not just selling the product, but trying to they are selling a product. Let's admit that they're selling a product, but it's a bit like Nike as well, with Colin Kaepernick and all the other quotes around standing up for what you believe in, just do it. And I think we need these types of messages within our adverts. But the Gillette advert really polarized one group of people who thought that men are all men are toxic. That's how they saw it. All men are bad. All men are bad. And the other side, which I would say I would agree. I think the advert is a powerful message. It's a needed message at this time in the world. But I started to look at the other side as well, and why are people saying this is such a bad advert? And I think we're living in a world just now where the narrative around boys and men, is very negative, right? And rightly so, because there's a small number of men out there who are doing some really horrible things, but that shouldn't badge everybody. And for me, the middle ground in this world, is the big part of my world, is I want a more positive narrative around boys and men, because young boys at 5 and 6 are growing up in a world where they're seeing messages about both men being bad, being sexual predators, being abusers. That's creating shame in the young head and in the young mind. So we need a more positive narrative around young boys and men, sort of men in general. But men need to embrace the dark side of masculinity. We can't, I don't think masculinity is toxic. I don't believe in this toxic masculinity. I respect people who say that. Masculinity isn't toxic. Certain parts of it are. And if we want to persuade people to come on our journey with us, we need to find a way of bringing them with us rather than pushing them away. And I think that's what we're seeing. We've got one side saying, great advert, men need to grow up and move on. Another side saying, this is shameful. No one's meeting.
Right.
And for me, the meeting part for that is, we need to accept the dark side of some men's acts and deal with it, but then talk about the good stuff, because we're going to be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, talking about the same stuff, because we're still polarized in our viewpoints. There's no doubt that most violence in this world is committed against men and boys and young boys. Sexual violence committed against men, it happens against young boys and girls and women. And we know the most perpetrator group is men. It's fact. I don't know why we don't just accept that. But when we say that, we're not saying that all men are the problem. Vast majority of men in this world are good guys. But we have to, find a way of agreeing these facts. But also when men are faced with these issues, we're often silent. And we saw that in the film that you're talking about with the young boys, the bystanders. Why is no one getting their friend away from the situation? But yeah, it's a difficult time. But unless we create, and that's what I like about the Hero Roundtable opportunities, to create the discussion, find the middle ground around some of these social issues, see from both sides. And we had a member of Parliament who was brutally killed a couple of years ago, Jo Cox, and her quote in our government was, we have more in common than which divides us. Right. And we have more in common, but unless we create a space for conversation, we're going to come from different camps, because we all want to fit into whatever, we all have the desire to be part of the inner circle, to fit into whatever part it's going to be. And unless we have debates, unless we have good leadership, and just now we have bad leadership from some of our politicians who are using this fear, using this polarized viewpoints, and they're capitalizing on that, I feel.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be a great place to finish. That's a great message to leave on, is that we need to find what's in common and have these conversations. So really appreciate your time, and looking forward to seeing you again in person sometime.
Hopefully.
Where can people find you if they want to look more into your work?
Well, I have a website, grahamgoulden.com, so that's GRAHAM, Goulden, GOULDEN.com. I'm on Twitter, at Graham_Goulden. Search me, say hello, come and speak to me. I love conversation.
He and I can attest to that. He does. He travelled to London to meet up with me a couple of years ago. Much appreciated, and thanks again for your early morning chat, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks very much, mate. You take care.